Welcome back to the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ. And they say the MAGA movement is fracturing. They say the coalition that reshaped American politics over the last decade is splintering. They say the energy that fueled the rise of Donald Trump is fading into the background. But here's the problem with that narrative. It doesn't even match reality. Because if you actually look at what's happening beneath the surface of American politics, the evidence points in the exact opposite direction. The movement has not collapsed. It's evolved like any good movement does. What started as an outsider rebellion against the political establishment has grown into something much larger and has grassroots infrastructure across the country. MAGA has independent media platforms that bypass the traditional gatekeepers. We have candidates winning primaries and entering the government institutions that once rejected them altogether. It has a cultural identity that extends far beyond election cycles. And perhaps most importantly, MAGA has a base of voters that continues to show up at the ballot box with the same intensity that shocked the political class in the first place. That does not just happen when a movement is dying. That happens when a movement is consolidating. Tonight, we're going to break down 12 reasons the political establishment keeps getting this story wrong. Other than the reason that they're retarded, 12 structural forces that explain why the MAGA coalition has remained cohesive while its critics keep predicting its collapse. Because when you step back and you look at the full picture, you start to see something that headlines keep missing. And this is not a temporary political movement, it's a realignment. And realignments don't just disappear just because the establishment wishes they would. So the first thing the political establishment refuses to understand about the MAGA movement is that it was never built like the traditional political machines they spent decades controlling. Most political coalitions in Washington are fragile because they're artificial. They're assembled by consultants, by donors, by party committees, and political firms that try to stitch together just enough voters to survive the next election cycle. Those coalitions are transactional. They exist for convenience, not conviction. And because of that, they fracture consistently and easily. Different factions fight over power. The messaging collapses. The movement dissolves the moment pressure is applied. That's not what happened with MAGA. The movement formed around a single, unmistakable political center, and that's Donald J. Trump. Whether the critics like it or not, Trump became more than just a political candidate. He became the organizing force of a political identity that millions of Americans believed had been ignored or mocked or deliberately pushed out of the national conversation for decades. Before Trump entered politics, those voters existed, but they were politically scattered. They were working class voters, energy workers, small business owners, border security voters, manufacturing communities, and millions of Americans who believed the political system had stopped representing them. They had no clear champion inside the political class, and Donald Trump became that person. Both parties had become experts at talking around these voters while prioritizing their global trade deals and corporate interests and endless foreign entanglements. The political establishment assumed those voters had nowhere else to go. And then Trump walked into the arena and said the quiet part out loud. He attacked the trade deals that hollowed out American manufacturing. He called out the failures of border enforcement. He challenged the foreign policy consensus that had dragged the country through decades of costly wars. And he did it in a way that didn't sound like the rehearsed language of professional politicians. The moment created something Washington hadn't seen in decades, a movement with a clear center. Trump did not simply just lead a campaign. He became the focal point of a political realignment. His voice, his messaging style, and his willingness to confront the establishment head on. That gave the movement a structure that most modern political coalitions never achieve, which is clarity. When a movement has clarity, it gains discipline. Supporters know what the movement stands for. Candidates know what message resonates with the base. Media voices aligned with the movement amplify the same themes. Instead of 10 competing factions arguing over direction, there's a shared political identity anchored by a recognizable leader. That is exactly why the predictions of fracture never seem to materialize. Critics keep on expecting the movement to collapse into internal infighting because that's how traditional political coalitions have fallen in the past. But MAGA was never designed that way. It was built around a central figure who became the symbol of a larger political rebellion against the ruling class in Washington. And when a political movement is anchored by a strong leader, outside pressure tends to strengthen it rather than break it. Every investigation, every indictment, every attempt by political opponents to remove Trump from the political arena, it had the opposite effect the establishment expected. Instead of scattering the base, it has reinforced the belief among supporters that the fight is bigger than one election cycle, and they keep proving it in their actions. That dynamic, it creates cohesion amongst the base. Movements that lack leadership, they drift into confusion. Movements with competing leaders, they fracture into rival camps, but movements that rally around a single political center develop something much harder to destroy, and that's loyalty. That loyalty is exactly why the MAGA movement continues to operate with a level of internal alignment that has frustrated the critics for about 10 years. Another reason the MAGA movement has not fractured the way the critics predicted comes down to something very simple that the political class constantly underestimates, and it's issue alignment. Not vague slogans, not consultant-crafted talking points, actual policy issues that millions of voters agree on with remarkable consistency. For years, the media narrative has been that the movement is driven purely by personality, that it exists by only because of one political figure and would collapse the moment the spotlight shifted away. But the argument ignores the foundation that actually holds the coalition together and its shared priorities. Across the MAGA base, you see remarkable agreement on a handful of core issues that voters believe the political establishment ignored for decades, one of them being border security. For years, Washington treated the southern border like an unsolvable inconvenience while communities across the country dealt with the consequences of an immigration system that many Americans believed had lost control of enforcement. And it's not just a belief. We all saw that it did. We completely stopped enforcing the border, and then it ruined our country. When voters inside the MAGA coalition talk about border security, they're not talking about abstract policy theory. They're talking about national sovereignty. They're talking about law enforcement. They're talking about whether the country has the right to control who enters its territory. That position cuts across regions, income levels, and political backgrounds inside this movement. The same alignment exists when the conversation shifts to economic nationalism. For decades, both parties treated global trade agreement as untouchable doctrine, and manufacturing jobs had disappeared. Entire industries were hollowed out. Small towns that once supported factories and supply chains watched those industries move overseas. The MAGA movement rejected the idea that this was simply the cost of modern economics. Instead of embracing the argument that American industry and American workers and American production should be defended and rebuilt. The message resonates deeply with voters who watched the economic foundation of their communities collapse while politicians insisted everything was okay. And then there's election integrity. Inside MAGA, there's a broad support for policies designed to reinforce public confidence in the elections. One of the most widely discussed proposals is the SAVE Act, which focuses on verifying citizenship requirements for federal elections. MAGA supporters argue that requiring proof of eligibility to vote is not radical. We see it as a basic safeguard designed to ensure that American elections are decided by American citizens only. So whether critics agree or disagree with that argument, the political reality is very clear. These issues unify our base. They create a shared platform that millions of voters can rally around regardless of personality, geography, or background. The border security, national industry, election integrity, when the movement aligns around specific policies and priorities like that, it becomes much harder to fracture because the coalition is not built on temporary enthusiasm. It's built on a set of issues that voters believe directly affect the future of the country. And that kind of alignment is exactly what keeps MAGA and the coalition operating as a unified political force instead of a splintering into a bunch of competing factions. One of the largest mistakes the political class keeps making when they analyze the MAGA movement is assuming it is purely a top-down phenomenon. They imagine a single political figure at the top and a passive audience below. And that's why they call us Nazis, because they think we're just following Hitler. Yeah, the entire movement was based around Donald J. Trump, but he is not the entire movement itself, and they can't wrap their heads around that. That's not how this movement actually functions, you know. What they consistently ignore is the massive grassroots infrastructure that has grown underneath the MAGA movement. Across the country, thousands of local political groups, activist networks, and citizen organizers have built their own communities, country level or county level organizations, right? Volunteer networks, independent media voices like this show right here, online communities that reach millions of people every single day. None of this was handed down from a party's headquarters in Washington. It was built from the ground up. The MAGA coalition did something that modern political movements rarely accomplish. It created an army of political engagement, engaging citizens who don't wait for instructions from the party elites, right? They organize rallies, they knock doors, they share information, they debate policy. They build local voter networks. They show up at school boards, city councils, and state legislations. This kind of grassroots infrastructure is incredibly difficult to dismantle once it takes hold because it is decentralized. It's a whole bunch of people moving as one movement, but everybody has their own minds. They're not liberals. They don't have a hive mind, right? This kind of grassroots infrastructure doesn't get taken down overnight, right? If a television network ignores the movement, supporters create their own media like we have here. If a newspaper refuses to cover certain issues, grassroots journalists, they go and they publish the information themselves, especially in today's media world, right? Where you can get things out to the entire world very easily. If a political institution attempts to shut down a conversation, thousands of independent voices pick it up and they amplify it nowadays. The result is a political ecosystem that it no longer depends on legacy institutions to survive. That shift is exactly why independent platforms have exploded in the recent years. Podcasting networks, independent news websites, online commentary channels, grassroots political blogs. Instead of waiting for traditional media outlets to decide what conversations are allowed, supporters are building their own platforms to speak directly to their audiences. And COVID had a really, really big part in this, right? When they were canceling everybody, lots of people had to go out there and start their own things, so they became cancelable. They were, in essence, too big to rig, right? That's how movements become durable. They stop relying on centralized gatekeepers that begin to create their own communication networks. And those networks are expanding. Every election cycle, new activists enter the arena. New independent voices begin covering issues that the mainstream press is ignoring. New grassroots media projects appear that allow citizens to bypass the old political filters that were once in place. That kind of infrastructure is exactly what keeps the movement alive between elections. And because political movements don't survive on candidates alone, they survive on participation. So when thousands of ordinary citizens are organizing, communicating, and building their own political platforms, the movement becomes much larger than just one person or one campaign. It becomes a self-sustained political culture. And that is exactly what is happening with MAGA. From local organizing to digital media platforms, the grassroots machinery behind the MAGA movement continues to grow, which means the foundation underneath it is getting stronger, not weaker, like the media consistently likes to say. One of the biggest power shifts in American politics over the last decade has not happened inside Congress. It happened in the media. For decades, a small group of legacy networks controlled the national conversation. If you wanted to reach millions of people, you had to pass through their gates. Television producers decided which stories were important. Newspaper editors decided which voices were allowed to speak, and cable panels debated the same talking points every night while pretending to represent the entire country. That system worked for a long time because there was very few alternatives, but the internet broke that monopoly. And when the MAGA movement emerged, it collided directly with a media establishment that had been spending decades shaping the narrative without serious competition, right? Supporters quickly realized something important. If the legacy press was not going to tell their story, they would build their own channels and tell the story themselves. And that's exactly what we're doing here. That is exactly what happens if you start oppressing media. An entire alternative media ecosystem exploded into existence almost overnight. Independent podcasts began to reach millions of listeners, and streaming shows replaced these cable panels. Newspapers or newsletters, they bypassed the corporate editors. Independent blogs and commentary platforms started publishing stories that traditional outlets refused to touch. The gatekeepers lost control of their microphone, right? That shift changed everything. Instead of waiting for approval from television producers and newspaper editors, supporters began speaking directly to each other with the internet, with social media. Ideas began to spread faster, debates became more open to everyone, and political commentary became decentralized from one area. Everybody became part of the conversation. That's why MAGA and its coalition has maintained messaging strength even under constant pressure from traditional media outlets, because the movement is no longer dependent on them. When one network pushes a narrative, dozens of independent platforms respond within hours, either agreeing or opposing. When the story is ignored by legacy outlets, grassroots journalists and digital competitors pick up the story and they amplify it across social media, podcasts, and independent websites, sometimes catching the attention of the legacy media, and then they pick the story up too. Information moves horizontally now. It moves through networks of creators and audiences who trust those voices because they believe those voices actually represent them or the same beliefs that they think they have. That trust is the key difference. For years, millions of Americans felt like the national media was speaking about them rather than speaking to them. The alternative media ecosystem flipped that dynamic. Now the conversation is happening inside communities that share a common perspective and a common set of concerns. And this is a good thing and a bad thing. It can radicalize also, and I think this is a main cause of the liberals becoming radicalized, is because they're in what they call, or we all call, an echo chamber, right? Now the conversation is happening, inside these communities where everybody is sharing the same common perspective and a common set of concerns. Those platforms continue to grow. Every year, more independent voices enter the arena. More creators launch shows, newsletters, and commentary channels that attract audiences, right? They're tired of the old broadcasting model and they're looking for something new. The result is the political communication network that is far more resilient than the traditional system it replaced. Nowadays, it's hard to break down all these individual voices when it was easier to just, call the network and say, hey, don't talk about this anymore. That doesn't take place anymore because somebody else will pick up the story and they will announce it to the rest of the world. Because you can't silence a decentralized media ecosystem unless you go after everybody. And even while you're doing that, that operation is going to be announced and you're going to be seen. You can't shut down thousands of independent microphones. As long as the ecosystem continues expanding, the MAGA movement will always have a direct line of communication with the voters who make up its base. For years, critics of the MAGA movement told the same story. They said it was a temporary uprising, it was a protest wave, a loud political movement that would eventually fade once the party establishment regained control. But that prediction ignored what was actually happening inside the political system. The movement did not disappear, and it's not going to. It entered an institution. What started as an outsider revolt was steadily transformed into real influence inside the Republican Party itself. In the early days, the relationship between MAGA and the Republican establishment was tense. Party leaders in Washington had spent decades operating under a familiar playbook: controlled messaging, carefully selected candidates, predictable policy priorities. Then millions of voters showed up demanding something very different. They wanted candidates who talked about border enforcement, economic nationalism, and the frustrations of the working class Americans who felt abandoned by both of the parties. They wanted representatives who were willing to challenge the political consensus instead of just managing it. And voters began enforcing that demand in the most powerful way possible through the primaries. Across the country, MAGA-aligned candidates started challenging entrenched incumbents. Political newcomers stepped into the races that party insiders assumed were already decided and flipped them. Grassroots voters poured energy into campaigns that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Some of those candidates lost, but many of them won. They won congressional seats, they won governorships, they won state legislator races. And every victory shifted the internal balance of power inside the party. What had once been treated as a populist rebellion outside the system began moving directly into the system itself. That transition matters because political movements become durable when they move from protest energy into institutional influence. Instead of shouting at the party from outside, the MAGA coalition began reshaping the party from within. Candidates aligned with the movement as they entered Congress, right? New voices began influencing legislative debates. Policy priorities that had once been dismissed suddenly became central to the party's platform. And the liberals and the Democrats watch MAGA form and watch MAGA start taking over the Republicans. And they did their own thing with the liberal movement. And look at where they're at. Which movement was a better movement, in your opinion? I think it's pretty clear. But the center of gravity, it started to move, right? Not because the party leadership decided to change direction, but because the voters demanded it. And when a representative system, in a representative system, right, the voters ultimately decide who sits in the seats of power. That's why the idea that the MAGA movement is fading continues to collide with reality. You can't describe a movement that's disappearing while its candidates are winning primaries and taking office or running the country, currently. That is not a decline. It's a consolidation. Again, the outside energy that shocked Washington in the beginning has now produced something far more significant, which is institutional presence. And once a political movement gains real footholds inside the governing structure, it becomes hard, really hard for its opponents to dismiss it as a passing movement, which they keep on trying to do, but MAGA's here to stay. Political movements that don't survive on slogans alone, they survive on results, right? Those are the movements that are going to survive. One of the reasons that MAGA and its coalition continues to hold together is because supporters believe the movement actually produced real policy outcomes when it had governing power under Donald J. Trump. The last time, the results were clear, and then we lost the results when we didn't elect him, but when we got the election stolen from us by Joe Biden. It was a stark contrast, and that matters more than the political class likes to admit. For years, American voters watched political campaigns deliver bold promises only to arrive in Washington and quietly retreat into the same cautious government style that had defined the city for freaking decades. Campaign season sounded revolutionary, right? Governing season looked exactly the same as it always had. The MAGA movement disrupted that cycle. When Trump entered office, supporters saw policies implemented that directly reflected the issues the movement had rallied around. Tax policies, right? Tax policy was one of the most visible examples. The administration pushed through major tax reforms designed to reduce corporate tax rates, encourage domestic investment, and stimulate economic activity. Supporters argue that those changes helped drive economic expansion, record low unemployment numbers before the pandemic, and renewed business investment across parts of the country that had struggled for years. We saw economic boom underneath Donald Trump that was undeniable, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. Whether critics agree with the strategy or not, supporters saw something they had not seen in a long time. It was a campaign promise turning into actual legislation. Immigration enforcement was another major example in the election this last time. For years, border security had been treated in Washington as a debate that produced endless speeches, right? But very little action. Under the Trump administration, though, the issue moved from rhetorical arguments into concrete policy decisions. And look at where the border's at now. Increased enforcement, border infrastructure projects, changes to asylum and immigration procedures, they're all pushed forward as part of a broader effort to reassert control over the border and a delivered campaign promise. So supporters of MAGA believe these policies reflect exactly what the movement had demanded during the campaign. And this is what we voted for. You see so many of us online and everywhere saying this is what I voted for. And this is the reason why. Because it is what we voted for. We're seeing things being delivered. That connection between promise and action created momentum for the MAGA movement, because when voters see policies implemented that match the issues they voted for, it reinforces a powerful perception. The movement is not just talking, it's actually governing. And that perception becomes incredibly important for a long-term political durability of a party, right? Movements that fail to deliver eventually lose credibility with their own base. Supporters grow frustrated. Enthusiasm fades. The coalition begins to fracture because voters start believing the political system cannot and will not produce the outcomes that they're promising. But when the movement can point out real policy victories, it strengthens the belief that political participation actually leads to tangible change. Tax reforms, immigration enforcement, regulatory rollbacks, energy policies designed to expand our domestic production. Each of those actions, they reinforce the idea among supporters that the movement was capable of translating political energy into governing results. And once voters believe that their movement can be, or that the movement can win policy battles, the momentum becomes self-sustaining because success breeds freaking loyalty. And loyalty is a fuel that keeps a political movement moving forward long after the election banners come down. For decades, the American left, right, they operated under political strategies built under identity. They still do, right? They govern underneath race identity, gender identity, cultural identity. They understand something very important about political movements, right? When people see politics as part of who they are rather than just something they vote for every few years, that movement becomes extremely durable because identity creates loyalty. For a long time, right, the political right did not operate that way. Conservative voters were often treated as a loose cannon that showed up during elections and then faded back into the background while Washington continued operating as usual. The MAGA movement changed that dynamic. MAGA does not view it as another campaign cycle or another political brand. We began to see it as a cultural and political identity tied to our vision of the country. And that shift matters because politics become identity. The movement stops behaving like a temporary coalition and it starts behaving like a long-term political tribe. Supporters rally around shared values, right? Shared concerns about the direction of the country, shared frustration with institutions they believe no longer represent them. And over time, those shared beliefs form a recognizable cultural identity. The symbol of that identity remains Donald J. Trump right now, but the identity itself goes much deeper than one individual. It's about a set of ideas: national sovereignty, economic self-reliance, law enforcement and border security, skepticism towards global institutions and political elites. rightfully so. When supporters identify that those principles as or they identify these principles as part of their worldview, the movement becomes something larger than a political campaign. It becomes a community. That community will express itself in many different ways through rallies and online networks and independent media platforms, grassroots political activism, cultural symbols that signal belonging to a broader movement. So critics will always dismiss that phenomenon because they misunderstand what it represents. They assume it is just enthusiasm, right? But identity politics is far more powerful than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm fades after elections. Identity persists for decades. That's why movements rooted in cultural identity tend to survive much longer than those built only around policy debates or party labels. They create a sense of belonging that goes beyond any single election cycle. And that is exactly what has happened on the right. The MAGA coalition is not simply a voting bloc that appears every 4 years. It has evolved. We have evolved into a cultural and political identity shared by millions of Americans who believe we are defending a particular vision of our country. Once a movement reaches that stage, predictions of collapse become much harder to sustain because identity-driven movements don't just disappear when a news cycle changes. They become part of the political landscape itself. MAGA is here to stay because MAGA is the political landscape right now. For years, the political establishment pushed a very confident narrative about the future of American politics. They said that the demographic change would permanently lock in political power for the Democrats. They insisted that certain communities would never vote outside of a political alignment that Washington consultants had assigned to them, right? So people in Washington said, blacks are always going to vote for Democrats. Mexicans will always vote for Democrats. Asians will always vote for Democrats. And they were wrong, pretty much. It comes down to the come down, they were wrong. Entire groups of voters were treated like fixed assets in an electoral spreadsheet, like they were never able to move from one column to another. That theory sounded impressive inside think tanks and television studios, but then reality started breaking the model, right? Over the last several election cycles, something unexpected began happening. Support for the MAGA movement started appearing in places the political class insisted it could never exist. Working class voters across multiple ethnic backgrounds began shifting their political alignment. Manufacturing workers, energy sector workers, construction workers, small business owners, first-generation Americans trying to build economic stability for their families. The young generation, for the first time ever, is super conservative. Because of pricing in America and because of the way the Democrats have thrown our country away to other countries and raised the price of living here for our own citizens. Many of these voters, they're not responding to traditional party labels. They're responding to issues that directly affect them in their daily lives, which is, border enforcement, economic opportunity, rising costs of living, crime in all the major cities, the belief that government policy should prioritize American workers. These concerns cut across ethnic lines far more than the old political models predicted, right? The result was, it was slow, but it was noticeable shift, right? In the composition of the coalition that rallied around Donald Trump, instead of shrinking into a narrow demographic corner, the movement began expanding into a broader working class base. The expansion matters for one simple reason. Political movements weaken when their coalition becomes smaller and more isolated, but movements that expand into new communities, they gain resistance. They gain new voters, new voices, new local leaders who carry the message into neighborhoods and industries that traditional political campaigns often overlook. And that is exactly what we're seeing happen. The MAGA coalition has increasingly drawn support from voters who feel the political establishment ignored their economic struggles and cultural concerns, right? These voters are less interested in the identity politics framework that dominated American discourse for years. More and more, they become more interested in policies that affect wages, jobs, safety, and stability for them and their own families, the things that affect them directly. That shift is forcing political strategists to rethink assumptions that once seemed untouchable. We're moving away from a generation that fought a war and destroyed the world and felt bad about it. So we paid taxes and allowed these other countries to get tariffs on us so they could rebuild. But that time is over, and those countries, they just kept taking from us. And the younger class has suffered from it. The middle class has suffered from it. And Americans began waking up to it. And now Americans are fighting for it. And that's what MAGA is all about. Instead of dividing voters into, separate camps, MAGA begins pulling them together under a broader working class identity. And that's why the demographic story surrounding MAGA and its movement looks very different today than it did when the political class first tried to define it. What critics pretend would shrink has instead evolved, and evolution is exactly how political movements survive. Another thing that political class, or the political class, miscalculated about MAGA and in this movement is how it reacts under pressure. In Washington, there has always been an assumption about how political coalitions behave when they face sustained attacks. The theory is simple. Apply enough pressure and the coalition will fracture. Investigations began. Media attacks, they escalate. Political opponents attempt to isolate the leader. Eventually, supporters begin drifting away. This is how the system it's designed to work. But when those tactics were used against Donald Trump, something very different happened. Instead of weakening the movement, the pressure hardened it. Every indictment, every investigation, every attempt to remove Trump from the political arena was supposed to shatter the coalition that formed around him. Instead, it triggered what political scientists often call the rally effect. Supporters did not scatter. They closed ranks. Many voters inside the movement began to see the consistent legal and political warfare not as normal partisan conflict, but as a direct attempt by the political establishment to neutralize a political figure who had disrupted the system they controlled. Whether critics believe that participation is justified or not is almost beside the point. Perception drives political behavior, guys. And perception among millions of MAGA supporters was that the fight had become bigger than one campaign or one election. The conflict had become a larger battle between a populist political uprising and an entrenched political establishment determined to crush us. That belief created solidarity within us. Movements that are under pressure, they often become more loyal to their leadership because supporters begin to view the attacks as confirmation, right? That the movement is threatened by political interests. But the unity of the MAGA coalition does not come from opposition alone, right? It also is powered by the economic message that brought millions of voters into the movement in the first place, which is economic populism. For decades, both political parties largely embraced the same economic framework, which was globalization. Globalization, the threat was it was inevitable to Americans. Trade deals were negotiated that encouraged corporations to move production overseas. Entire manufacturing regions across the United States saw factories close and supply chains relocate to other parts of the world because it was cheaper, less taxed, because we forced it out of our country. Political leaders assured the country that these changes were simply the national evolution of a global economy. But the millions who were working in those factories, the millions of Americans who were fired, they faced the consequences, and it wasn't theoretical, right? Factories closed, wages stagnated, communities built around industrial jobs completely collapsed. The MAGA movement stepped directly into that frustration and offered a very different argument. Instead of accepting the decline of American industry and the unavoidable collapse of American industry, the movement embrace the idea that national policy should actively defend domestic production, tariffs on foreign competitors, the incentives for companies to manufacture inside the United States, energy policies designed to expand American production, a broader push to rebuild industrial capacity. That message resonated. It resonates deeply with voters who believe the economic system had been, tilted against them for decades, because economic populism, it speaks directly to the material reality of people's lives. It's about jobs, it's about wages, it's about whether the next generation will have the same opportunities as their parents once had. And we all see that those generational opportunities are becoming less and less, or more and more expensive. When that economic message combines with the rally effect created by constant political opposition, it produces something very powerful. A movement that sees itself as both economically justified and politically embattled, and movements that believe they are fighting for both the economic future and against a hostile political establishment, they tend to become incredibly resilient. Pressure doesn't break them, pressure fuels them, and pressure continues to make a diamond out of MAGA. One of the clearest indicators that the MAGA movement is not collapsing is something very simple, and that's voter participation. Political movements that are dying do not produce energized voters. They produce apathy. They produce empty rallies, declining turnout, and supporters who quietly drift away from the political arena because they believe the fight is over. That is not what is happening with the coalition that's built around Donald Trump. Election after election, voters aligned with the movement continued to show up. Primary elections, midterm elections, local races, state races. Supporters who were once considered politically disengaged are now participating at levels that surprise the very strategists who thought the movement would, burn out after a single election cycle. Really, this sustained turnout, it tells you something really important, and it's that the base is not disillusioned. It's mobilized, because when voters feel like they're part of a movement that actually represents their frustrations and priorities, they don't disappear after the campaign signs come down, right? They stay engaged. They vote again. They bring new voters to the process. This is what MAGA is about. There's so many passionate people like you, like me, that continue to push MAGA, and that's why MAGA is absolutely going nowhere. That kind of consistent participation is the backbone of this long-lasting political movement. And what makes the MAGA coalition even more unusual is that it did not remain confined into elections. It's developing into a culture. Political movements that remain purely electoral, they often fade between cycles. They exist only during campaigns, and they dissolve back into everyday life once the ballots are cleared, right? Or once the ballots are counted. The MAGA movement, it does something different. It expands into cultural space, right? Supporters begin producing memes that spread across the internet. Slogans become recognizable symbols of political identity. Independent creators launched podcasts like this podcast right here, or 4547 blog. Commentary channels, right, that discuss politics outside the framework of legacy media. Merchandise becomes available. Don't forget to stop by 4547 blog. You like that plug? Where you can support MAGA with the hats. Everybody knows what the red hat is. There's apparel, there's flags, there's symbols that represent the movement that has become a cultural identity for a lot of Americans. These cultural markers, they seem trivial to critics, but they serve a powerful political function. They reinforce the identity of this political movement. They remind supporters that the movement is larger than any single election and larger than any one political movement itself. When the political movement develops cultural symbols, right, shared language and independent communication platforms, it becomes embedded in everyday life. And once a movement reaches that stage, it becomes extremely difficult to erase, because elections can come up and they can go, and candidates may rise and fall, but the cultural movement persists. You know, MAGA survives news cycles. MAGA survives election losses. MAGA survives the constant predictions of others who insist the movement is about to disappear. The continued turnout in the ballot boxes combined with the cultural ecosystem surrounded by the movement, it tells a very clear story. This is not a temporary political flare-up. This is a political and cultural force that millions of Americans have integrated into their identity, their communities, and their daily conversation. And movements that reach that level of participation do not simply vanish when political establishments wish they would, right? When you step back and look at everything we just broke down tonight, one thing becomes pretty clear. And I feel like it's the political establishment keeps analyzing the MAGA movement using the wrong framework. They keep treating it like it's a temporary campaign, a passing wave, a political personality cult, right? The Nazis is what they say. But that was supposed to fade once we were supposed to fade, right? Once the headlines changed and all this pressure was mounted on us. But this movement, it's not built on personalities, and it will not collapse quickly. What we just walked through tonight tells you a very different story. This movement has leadership. It has issue alignment. It has grassroots infrastructure that stretches across the entire country and the world. It has its own media ecosystem that bypasses the traditional gatekeepers, so we will still get our news out there. It has candidates inside the government institutions. It has policy victories that supporters believe produced real results. It has cultural identity, expanding demographics, and voters who continue to show up election after election. That is not what a collapsing movement looks like. That is what a political realignment looks like. And realignments do not disappear on command. They reshape the landscape. The coalition that rallied around Donald Trump did something Washington had not seen in decades. It connected millions of Americans who believed the political system had stopped listening to them. It was working class voters, small business owners, energy workers, parents concerned about the direction of the country, citizens who believed national sovereignty, economic independence, and cultural stability still mattered. Once those voters discovered that they could operate with a unified political force, the rules of American politics changed. The old guard, it can't fight it. They can mock it, they can investigate it, but they cannot pretend it does not exist anymore, because movements built on identity, participation, and shared political purpose, they don't vanish between news cycles. They become part of the political foundation of the country, and that is exactly what we're watching unfold. This is NINJ with the New Conservative Radio Show. Stay sharp, stay informed, and the conversation is just getting started. Until next time, stop by 4547blog.com and support the movement.